Hello.
Hello AOS fans!
It's the Agents of Embergard.
And in this video we're looking at all the changes that you'll find in the brand new edition.
Yes, in this video we're going to be going through all the big changes.
The small changes.
And the silly changes.
And I know in the front of the video I said we were going to do all the changes, but we're not. We're going to do as many as we can.
As many as we found.
And as many as we found, and maybe we might miss some out if they're completely irrelevant. But these are a lot of the changes in Warhammer Underworlds.
If you think we've missed something out, do stick it in the comments below and don't forget to like.
And subscribe.
And now we're going to crash on with the rest of the video. So we're going to start with the silly ones, because, you know, why not?
Or because we're silly.
Yeah, that's true. To start with, single assists and double assists are now called flanked and surrounded.
Yeah, I could sort of see what they were going for, but at the same time, double and single assists really made sense. Defense dice have changed their name to save dice.
Activations have completely gone from the game.
What?
They're called turns.
Turns, yes. I'm not overly lovely of that change because I liked activation and I knew where I stood, but a turn can be very generic.
I had a turn when I read it.
You know, it is what it is. It doesn't really change things that much, but it was such an integral part of Warhammer Underworlds. The activation tokens, it's my activation, it's your activation. It's all gone.
Now it's the same term, but it's much more efficient because you've got activation. We're saying 3 syllables every time.
It's a lot fewer syllables. That is absolutely true.
And one of the biggest silly changes we've found
are the roll-offs.
You used to roll 4 dice and just count the crits.
You've probably seen this on some of the other games that have been played, but yes, you only roll 1 dice now, and it's not silly in itself, and there is a reason for it. It's because there's a new underdog mechanic, and the tie is resolved by who's the underdog, and if you've rolled 4 dice, it'll be tied less often. So I can see why they've done it. However, it doesn't quite make sense anymore because it goes crit, sword, which is worse than hammer, but then hammer, because hammer, there are more hammers than sword, so you get ties more often. But then to double assist and single assist, I think. No,
then onto flanked and surrounded.
Oh, you're absolutely right. So already a change there that I've forgotten.
Yeah.
So
there you go.
It is not as intuitive as roll 4 dice, count the crits, count the single assists, count the double assists. It is not as intuitive, but maybe it will be in 7 years' time. So now we're going to go on with the big ones. Now you've probably heard a lot of these, so we're going to rattle through them really, really fast. The first one is, it's 1 board, and it's bigger than that. It folds out to 4 ways.
4 times the size, in fact. The next one is there's no multiplayer game.
Yeah, I know there are a few people who commented that they're going to miss that, and that's how they play with their group, but I think it was a much underutilised version of the game, and it's gone completely, presumably to cut down on card wording and to cut down on rulebook size. However, there was a Warcom article which said multiplayer rules were coming, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Yeah.
Another one that may have escaped some people is that card art has changed. It's now photos.
It's all photos. People have views.
And we're just going to leave it at that.
And we can't do anything about it, so just carry on. Another big change, which has caused a reasonable amount of consternation across the internet world, are there are no more faction decks. Another big change with those photos are the fighter cards. They're completely different. There's no text on them. They're really clear. There's lots of symbols, which you kind of need to learn what they are, but that's very straightforward. But they've lost all that clutter from the old game, so that's really great. And they have big photos on them, so you can tell which model is which when you're playing.
Where's all that clutter gone, you might ask? On the new War Scrolls. This contains all the stuff that's special to your warband, including the expire condition, the special rules that they might have, and once per game, or maybe more often, abilities. On the other side, you've got a picture of all the warband, a little bit of blurb, and all their names.
Another change which has caused some consternation is that there are no faction decks.
Yeah, they've been chopped out, but there's probably some very good reasons for the actual game's health for that.
Yeah, it's going to cut down on changes and complications, so it's sad, but I think a good move.
A new mechanic they've added is underdog, which means if you've got less glory than your opponent, you're the underdog. Yeah,
and this triggers a few extra effects that can kind of help you catch up. We've only played a couple of games, you haven't really seen them have a massive effect. The jury's out on that one, but I quite like it.
Yep.
One rule that the jury's not out on is the new focus rule, which replaces the old discard a card, pick up a card kind of rules that existed in the old game. This basically, you can just discard your whole hand, whatever cards you want, pick up whatever you want, and then you can draw an extra power card.
Yep, so if you get rid of 2 cards, you'll pick up 3 at the end of it.
Which is quite nice.
Really helps get rid of some of that feel bad when you're sitting there with a bricked hand and you don't know what to do. Glory, which is quite a mainstay element of the game, has changed quite a bit in that you no longer spend glory when you put upgrades on.
No, your upgrades that are on your card should have to equal to the number of glory you've got. And so if a fighter with upgrades on is killed, you basically can then put new upgrades on new fighters, which is quite nice. Another interesting change is that fighters give more glory. Effectively, the bigger the fighter, the stronger they are, the more glory they give you, which I think is a really nice change, because certainly back in the old Shadespire days, the same amount of glory for a Morog as for a Rattling was totally unfair.
Another big change around glory is that upgrades that all used to just cost 1 glory at one point don't all just cost 1 anymore. Some of them cost 0 and some of them cost 2.
Yep, all upgrades are not created equal, and now that has been reflected in their cost. Another little change they slipped in there is that raised fighters no longer give extra bounty if you kill them a second or third or fourth time.
Yeah, when the Spoiled Guard and all those warbands that could bring the fighters back in the past were just feeding more glory into the machine, now you'll get a little raise counter, and fighters with raise counters give 0 glory. So once they've been killed once, there's a lot less reason to kill them again.
Absolutely, but they've kind of kept that. Each warband kind of has 7 glory when you kill it. So far, we've seen. So that's really good, and it does mean you can't glory farm the sort of weaker warbands.
The game has completely done away with the lethal hexes. Now all you've got are stagger hexes and blocked hexes.
Yeah, it's not the most obvious change because they kind of look the same on the table, but they now just stagger you. They don't do any damage. And of course, the biggest change of all is that they've changed how crits work. No longer can your 5 dice attack with rerolls be stopped by a single crit.
Yeah, if you roll a crit, then you haven't automatically won. It still counts as just a success. But if you get more crits than your opponent, then if you're the attacker, you can push them back and you can follow up into the hex they were in. And if you're the defender, you can actually stop them pushing you back and reduce the damage by 1.
I mean, that's kind of like 3 great rules changes in one.
It is.
They're really excellent changes all across the board. I really like them.
And one of the last ones is that there's no magic anymore.
No magic dice.
No casters.
And we haven't seen what's going to happen with warbands that had casters in them, how it's going to work. I suspect there'll be abilities on their war scroll card, but they won't be using magic dice, that's for sure.
Yeah, they'll either be using the defense dice or the attack dice, and they'll just be keying all of their abilities off of hammers and shields and stuff instead.
Yeah, one assumes there might not be spell gambits anymore because spells aren't really a thing, but we just don't really know. But there are definitely no magic dice and no magic.
No magic attacks either, which means that there's a lot less confusion with some warbands where you're like, oh, they've got a spell attack, but they're not a wizard. Does it count as a spell? Does it count as an attack? What does it all mean?
What does it mean? So that's gone.
So those are all the major changes, and hopefully you're still with us, because we're going to go on to more of the subtle ones now, and these can be tricky to spot, and they might not feel like they've done a lot, but they can sometimes be quite a big change.
Exactly, they're subtle because they're not major changes, but also subtle because they influence the game in ways we perhaps hadn't quite expected.
So one of the first sort of subtle changes is that the entire beginning of the game sequence has changed. You roll once at the very start after you've already drawn your cards.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting change in itself. You already know what you're going to do before you start, which is quite good, I think.
Yeah, you draw your cards, then you roll and you pick boards and you turn the board and you place all your objectives, you place all your fighters. It just makes the whole process a lot smoother.
Yeah, but there's even a subtle change within that change, Pete. Whoever wins the roll-off has to pick the board.
Yes.
There's no kind of like this, I'm going to choose what board.
Yep.
You have to pick this board. And even though we knew that, we still managed to forget when we played our game.
And also, when you're rolling off for the beginning of the turn to decide who goes first, whoever loses that roll-off always gets a card.
Yeah, so even though the winner of that roll-off will pick who goes first, if they pick not to go first, they don't get a card. Yeah. It's still your opponent that gets the card.
And we got that wrong too several times.
So one of the most confusing concepts in the whole of Warhammer Underworlds was the super action. And it's confusing no longer because it's gone.
There are no super actions at all.
No, so that means we've lost things like barge, which I'm sure will be a great loss to many people, and also scything. So there's no more scything attacks. And the charge wording is just worded so you basically do what a charge did, but it's not a super action in itself.
So most weapon abilities like cleave and ensnare,
grievous,
they've all been turned into what they call room marks, and one important thing now is that you can only ever use one of those in your attack.
Yeah, so there's no Voltroning anymore. There's no like putting loads of upgrades on a fighter and giving them cleave and ensnare and grievous, maybe 2 grievuses, multiple grievuses, and just doing the most ridiculous attack. You basically just have to pick one or t'other. And there's even a new room mark for the grapple ability.
Ooh. And all that means is that instead of when you attack someone, you normally push them away from you. Grapple allows you to push them into another hex. You might even be able to push them towards you, move them into a more favourable position for later attacks. And
none of the fighters have that built in on their cards.
No.
I haven't seen it in any of the abilities we've added with the games we've played.
No.
But I really quite like that ability. It was really good. I hope we see more of that, because it was only really like 2 or 3 fighters out of all a million fighters in the game who did it in the old version. So I'm looking forward to seeing whether grapple becomes more prevalent.
When a fighter is slain, they lose all of their upgrades now, all of their tokens, and they become uninspired. Sad skelly noises.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting change, and I wonder whether we'll see how that's going to affect the game. That's a really subtle change at the moment, because it doesn't really seem to me any different, but it might.
Yeah, I mean, there was always that tactic of getting your champion and putting a load of upgrades on to make him really nasty, and then you kill him and he comes back and he's a bit better, and he keeps doing what he's doing. So it changed that quite fundamentally, so it'll be interesting to see how the warband as a whole copes with that.
So another rule that wasn't used very often and often caused discussion and consternation was the trap rule, and that's gone now. There's no concept of being trapped.
And also when delving what are now treasure tokens, used to be objectives, and that's another little subtle change in there, you become staggered, but you can then do it again the next turn, even if you've got a stagger counter, which you didn't used to be able to do.
Yes, stagger tokens no longer stop you from delving. You can only delve once per turn, but you can delve when staggered, and you can be on guard while staggered as well, which is quite interesting.
We mentioned earlier there are no wizards, there are also no beasts. The only things that have a little icon now are leaders and flyers.
There's been a little change to how surges work. Obviously the whole surge infrastructure is all gone, but now basically if you score a surge card and draw a new one, you can outscore that until the next turn.
Much more straightforward.
Absolutely. There's no sudden, I actually score this one now because it's a new surge step.
Also, another little trick that people used to pull was you could salvage cards. If you had a card in your hand for a fighter and they were dead, you could get rid of it and you could draw another one in the power step. But as cards don't have fighter names on anymore, because there are no warband specific decks, there's no more salvage.
There are now 2 different types of attack in the game. I think we kind of all refer to them as this, but they've been formalised. There are melee attacks, which have little cross swords, and there are ranged attacks, which have a little bow.
This is quite important because some upgrades will only work on melee attacks, some will only work on ranged attacks, and some abilities may only work on melee or ranged attacks in the future, which means that people can't overpower those ranged attacks quite so much. Also, the attack dice have had their faces renamed. It's not Smash and Fury anymore, it's just good old-fashioned hammers and swords.
Which is what everybody called it anyway, GW. So far, there are generally far fewer keyword shenanigans. There are domains.
There are domains,
but we have seen far fewer kind of, there's no hunters, there's no quarries, there's no assassins, there's none of that. Fewer keywords.
Hooray.
There's a few other things that have been got rid of. There's no scatter token.
There's no dual or hybrid objectives anymore.
And there's no plundering now when you take someone out of action, which will be missed by almost nobody.
What's plundering? There's also no more stun or barge actions, which I'm sure nobody cares about.
Keeping everything more streamlined, there's no more knockback, which again will hardly ever got used.
And because of the way that bounty works on fighters now, there's no large fighters, it's just that fighter's worth this much glory.
And there's another subtle change, which we haven't really quite seen how it works yet. I suspect it will be referenced in the tournament document when we get to see that. There are now rules for major and minor victories in Warhammer Underworlds.
If you've got a tie on your glory, then it starts looking at who has fighters left, who has fighters on objectives and all that kind of thing. And if you win on one of those kind of sub-win levels, then it's a minor victory rather than a major victory.
Yeah, the only way to get a major victory is to have more glory than your opponent. And if you've got less glory than your opponent, you lose.
Boo. So there are what we think are most of the really big,
very tiny,
and slightly silly
changes to Warhammer Underworlds.
If we've missed something out that you think is a big, small or silly change, let us know in the comments below.
Absolutely, and please, please, please don't moan about the card art.
No, that's off limits now. We've moved on from that one. If you want to see more content about Embergard and other stuff to do with Underworlds, then do click that like button.
And do click that subscribe button.
And don't forget to set the bell so that you'll get notified every time we have a new live stream set up or another video brought out.
And please do consider supporting us on Patreon. You can join our Patreon Discord where we chat every day about Underworlds, and obviously there's going to be so much stuff to chat about, and you'll get to shape where the channel moves next.
So we'll see you soon, probably in the Embergard.